Chapter 17. Baron stood, white-knuckled and wide-eyed, in the gorge tower. He clutched the beacon dagger in his hand and gaped as the world disintegrated around him. A great roaring tide of Phyrexians swept toward the walls. As a whole army, they were terror personified. As individual creatures, they were worse still. Many of the beasts were gigantic, white and meaty, seeming to have taken their forms from the blind shrimp larvae that infested the gorge lake. They scuttled on sharp, darting legs, their scaled backs hunched in heinous intent over minuscule eye nubs. Barbed antennae tasted the air. The warm brine of human blood drew them on. Others had wolf-like figures, all warped and elephantine, with a mane of mange over leathery skin speckled in black and pink. Only their heads diverged from the lupine plan, small, yellow, puffy, and indrawn like the heads of jaundiced babies. A vast number of the company were human or semi-human, though their bodies had been torqued and tortured into forms unrecognizable, leering death masks of flayed muscles, spidery arms with sinews realigned so that Radius and Ulna became opposing pinchers, rib cages inset with spikes of stone or metal, bellies implanted with poison bladders that splashed foes in acid, hips that were no more than winnowed bone of tarry ligament, and legs that ended in sharpened spikes of bone. Most of the beasts bore weapons stripped from ruined runners of falcons. In a few places, machines of Crick's own design shambled among the monstrous hordes. "We ourselves have armed them," Baron whispered. Against this onslaught of horror came the defenders of Talaria. Baron activated an array of power stones linked to mechanisms across the island. What falcons remained streaked down in furious flight. The white vapor trails behind them traced a converging fan across the sky. Impacting along the surging front, the falcons seemed to be allied lightning strikes. They brought with them a vast rolling thunder. Fiends were hurled back into the chopping jaws of their fellows. The falcons' incandescent arrival was followed by their ratchet and whine of their shredding mechanisms. Blood green and a shade of lavender that might have been pretty if it weren't steamy and acidic fountained amid bounding chunks of meat and bone. Baron's delight at this grisly assault was short-lived. The hordes behind only splashed through the remains of their comrades and pressed the charge. Baron squeezed the dagger handle and simultaneously signaled the second wave of defenders. Hundreds of Talarian runners lunged up from their trenches at the base of the wall. The machines loped into combat, their scythe wings poised to strike. They darted out, long-legged and fearless. The twang and whoosh of quarrels sounded from the ports that lined their bellies. Shafts soaked in anti-oil of biological poison designed to separate Phyrexian blood thudded home in the pelting lines of monsters. Phyrexians released a corporate shriek that rattled stones and sheared leaves from their branches. Another line of dead and dying went down, those not in a slick slough of a quaking mound of muscle and bone. The monstrous charge followed on, clamoring over the fallen. Talarian runners met them, striking with twin blades. Some of the beasts were cut in half. Others were torn open at the belly and ran on a few paces before light fled their eyes and they rolled wetly in the dirt. A few were unstoppable. Though runners hung from scythes buried in their bellies, the beasts advanced, dauntless. They had a healthy horde of fiends surged into a waiting phalanx of scorpion engines. Urza's scorpions were not designed for speed. With 6 legs, massive pinchers, and darting tails, they were made to stand and fight. They held their position as the beast's army fell on them. The first monsters literally fell, legs cut away, their bleeding bulks dropped atop the stooped shoulders of the scorpions, who merely shrugged them off to snag the next comers. More Phyrexians lost their legs. A third wave leapt onto the backs of the beasts, only to be undone by darting tail stingers. The dead mounded up. In time, the machine's pinchers became pinned beneath tons of oozing flesh. All the while, fiends fought onward into a hail of shafts from human guards on the walls. Then the first Phyrexian won through. It was a giant creature with a body as bulbous and pitted as an old gourd. It lugged past furiously, stinging tails, rolled over the wall of dead, and crashed mightily against the stone rampart around the school. White arrows stood in a thicket across the beast's figure, but they did not stay it. The thing lunged again, smashing into the wall. A jagging crack opened from the battlements to the footings. More monsters clambered past the buried scorpions and reached the wall. They added their bulk to the giant's assaults or scampered up the cut edges of stone or flung tentacular digits to haul themselves over. In moments, the walls would be breached. Baron realized they were already breached. The walls and cisterns poured monsters into the midst of the school. The battlefront had broken into 1,000 pieces, and every scholar and every student would fight the legions of hell alone. Not entirely alone. Baron's fingers danced across the glittering gemstones. He called all remaining pumas from their forest posts into the school. He awakened every mechanism in the Hall of Artifact creatures, from Yoshin warriors to Tanos' clay men to Suchi loaders and conveyors and logging machines. Every last one would fight today, on this last day of Talaria. His summonations done, Baron turned and descended into the dark spiral that led to the yard below. He would fight too, with spells and staves and this dagger that had proven no other defense, even his nails and teeth and bones if it came to it, when it came to it. Urza was dead, and soon all of Talaria would be. In the midst of all the shrieking wail of forest fires and trapped animals and tortured elves, the man in the wood heard a greater conflict. Phyrexian cries, macerating machines, whistling arrows, men screaming, children dying, and in the throat of them all echoed one name: Urza! 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 He knew the name of the defiler. He knew the bane of Argoth, but this Urza was a different one, a benevolent creature of great power, a mentor, an advocate, a protector. These voices did not cry out in hatred and rage, but in need and hope and supplication. They cried out to a very different Urza. They cried out to him. In the deafening clamor of their voices, Urza remembered who he was. The mind of the forest pressed in upon him with sudden violence, straining to quell the thought. After 5 years of torture and penance, Yavamaya's fury was spent. The forest had come to know the man it had so hated. It had subsumed him into its web of life. No, Yavamaya's fury was spent, and its rage was nothing beside the fury of the battle that summoned Urza. He forced back the mind of the wood. He recomposed his being from the drifting shreds of it within the vast tree. He brought his mind into sudden, keen focus. Yavamaya made one final grab at him. Multani, the soul of Yavamaya, impelled himself into the form of the awakening planeswalker. He fused with the forming figure, struggling to root him in place, but it was too late. Urza vanished from the heart of the tree. He was suspended for only a sliver of time in the fold between worlds, but during that moment he could feel a presence imprisoned within him. Multani. In a single instant, his captor had become his captive. There was no time to think of Multani. Urza stepped from the wheel of eternities into a precise moment, a precise space. Walls of ancient gray metal took shape around him, large windows of dark glass, levers and gears, fire belching from glowing forges. It all came into being. None of these things mattered. Only the sharp-eyed and dark-skinned Gitu woman in their midst mattered. She had been crouched over a set of plans, arguing some point with a gesticulating goblin when Urza arrived. Joyer whirled about, slack-jawed. "Gather your best fighters. Talaria is overrun. I'll return and take you there." He was already fading from being before his orders were complete. The shocked stare of Joyra followed Urza into the spinning spaces. He sensed a similar amazement from Multani. That amazement redoubled the next moment as Urza stepped into the chaos of Talaria. The walls were breached. The guards along them were merely boneless heaps or red streaks on white stone. Phyrexians poured like roaches through the gaps. They flooded up the shattered grates hurriedly fastened over the wellheads. They swarmed through burst doorways and down stone corridors. They fought those who could resist and fastened teeth on those who couldn't. Throughout Urza's field of sight, monsters tossed students and scholars like white rags. Urza rose from the dirt where his feet and alighted for a moment. He floated straight into the air and unleashed red bolts down on the rings of wells in the main courtyard. The blast of energy sailed down the throats of the channels. They flashed past the shadowy forms that scuttled upward. At the waterline, a sudden inferno erupted. Red water and black charred bodies geysered from the wells. The ground around each well had mounded up in swollen distress. In the next moment, rock and mortar and dirt cascaded down into fire-fused plugs. The wells were closed. The Phyrexians below would drown. Urza spun about and cast another sorcery. Red beams darted out to each jagged breach in the wall. Limestone grew molten, folded over the creatures struggling through the gap. It solidified. The wall was once again whole. Urza kept rising. He hurled more fire outward, rings of the stuff. Force hissed from his hands in arcs of steam and coalesced over the walls to sweep away the raging throng. The vanguard of the attack turned to black statues and then sifting ash. Flames broke out in a great bale. Dancing orange fire shimmered across the black surge and headed toward the verges of the forest.
"Still the killer, aren't you?"
Said a mind within Urza.
"You would slay every bird and beast to kill the creatures that oppose you."
The wall of fire whirled in one last red roar before dissipating, not singeing so much as a leaf tip. The accuser within fell conspicuously silent. Urza allowed himself a small smile until the next wave of monsters emerged from the eaves of the woods and stomped forward among twisted bodies and piles of dust.
This is the horror I sought to stop in Argoth all those years ago,
Urza explained to the presence within him.
This is the horror I still fight. There will not be another Argoth.
Again, only silence answered. Urza's eyes glittered in their gemstone aspect. Extending a hand outward, he made a certain sign. One wing of the Phyrexian host swung in upon the other. Fiends leapt on fiends, bit through brains, sliced off heads. With another sweep of his hands, Urza dragged fallen beasts from the dead pile by the wall, digging free his ranks of scorpions. The machines hauled themselves from the slimy darkness where they had been buried and clambered toward the new line of advance.
That should hold them for a moment,
the planeswalker told himself. He drifted back down within the walls. Below him, scores of machines, students, and scholars fought against the ubiquitous foe. Among them, one gray-haired man battled with an especial fury. He carried only a dagger, but made it work like a sword-slashing, striking, parrying, piercing. Already around him on the dusty ground, monsters lay in piles. The dagger he wielded called to the pendant around Urza's throat. Even more, though, the man drew him. He sank a fatal blow in the dinner plate eye of the creature he fought, and it spilled sloppily out of his way. Urza alighted where the beast had been, and for his efforts, got a dagger in the gut. He smiled tightly.
Baron, good to see you as well.
Turning white, Baron drew his blade from his master's belly. It emerged, bloodless, and the man's belly and shirt formed themselves behind the retreating knife.
Urza!
I thought you were dead, he yammered, stupidly.
Not quite. I have mended the wall and staved off the main attack, Urza said urgently. But this must end today. I must kill Kirk.
We cannot last, Baron gasped, almost pleading.
Outnumbered, outmaneuvered, out of breath. I will bring reinforcements.
So saying, Urza winked suddenly from existence. Like a man stepping across a hall from one room to another, Urza strode across the corridor of worlds and stepped into the forge room of Shiv. A sizable assembly awaited him. Joyra was at the front of the group, with a rank of 12 modified Talarian runners behind her, creatures of Thran metal. The platoon of humans numbered 35 and included Teferi and all the other scholars and students brought to the land nearly a decade before. They were serious now, grown-up and fire-hardened, like the metal they so expertly made. Beside them was a contingent of 40 lizard men, including Diego Derv and the picked warriors of the Bay's personal bodyguard. The young fire drake, Ramadargaz, accompanied them, along with Karn, the Silverman. Next to these clean and orderly troops, a ragtag collection of jumpsuited goblins clustered. Many bore the crude tribal weapons they had brought to the rig 5 years ago. Others carried only the largest, heaviest, sharpest, or most wicked-looking items from their toolboxes. Joyra stepped forward with a military snap, accompanied by Diego Derv and a scrappy little goblin with eyebrows that reached beyond his nose. This warrior gave what it considered to be a rigid salute. Joyra addressed Urza. Your troops are assembled. Your allies have provided more than token forces.
I see that,
said Urza, his eyes flashing on Ramadargaz and Karn. He indicated them and turned to Diego.
You realize, of course, that these 2 prizes of yours may be sacrificed in the coming battle? Sacrifice for the tribe is our highest honor,
Diego responded with stern sincerity. Urza's eyes passed one more time over the forces. Despite their numbers and their resolve, they would not be enough. He breathed deeply and said simply,
Come with me.
The planeswalking wave that swept out from him encompassed them all in an eye blink. It bore with it Urza's latest enchantment, a mass effect spell that turned the troops two-dimensional while in the space between worlds. Thran metal walls melted away to whirling chaos. Ancient enemies, Viashino, goblin, fire drake, human, and machine hung flatly together in the emptiness, and then the company resolved out of air into the boiling battle of the Talarian courtyard. There was no time for orders. There were no columns marching into battle. There was only space for a breath and a pivoting on one heel and striking whatever horrific figure loomed blackly up out of battle. The jangle of Thran metal portings joined the clang of goblin axes on Carapace. The Silverman fought with bare hands and gargantuan strength. The Fire Drake, the only beast that was a match in size for the gibbering monsters, slew with tail and claws and teeth and breath, all. Talaria's defenders gave a ragged cheer as the monsters faltered. But it would still not be enough. Urza planeswalked again. He left Talaria for the lofted eyrie of the ancient dragon, Jeradargaz. In moments, he appeared in the woven nest as he had before, sudden and stunning and businesslike.
It is I. There's a planeswalker, he announced.
The drake was huge and red against the great weave of tree, bow, and tar. She raised a grizzled head and regarded Urza angrily.
I thought you were dead. I can regain your son, great Jeradargaz.
Her head came erect.
Say on. You must fight for me. You must fight for me and the Viashino and the goblins. Your son fights for us even now. I will take you to the place where Ramadargaz is, and you must fight side by side with him. Ally yourself with us and save us in battle, and your son will be returned to you."
A suspicious glare entered the beast's narrowing eye.
"Fight whom?"
Urza's eye was a sharp mirror of the drake's.
"You must fight the enemy of us all, the creatures that would kill every last one of us. The monsters at the door."
"Ah, yes,"
said the drake slyly.
"Urza and his Phyrexians."
"I have no time for games," Urza said sternly. "Come with me now and fight to regain your son. Do not come at all."
The drake lifted herself to her full, impressive height. She drew her wings tightly about scaly shoulders and darted her massive head in beside the planeswalker.
"I go."
Urza took hold of the beast's shaggy mane and climbed onto her long neck.
"Unfold your wings,"
he ordered.
"and prepare a gout of flame."
The drake complied, her leathery wings stretched to their full extent.
"We go,"
Urza said. With a thought, the deed was done. Urza and the dragon folded into immutable geometry. Planar creatures, they careened through the pitching corridor of space. In moments, the veil of that middle place dropped away, replaced with rushing treetops and a bright, cloud-cluttered sky. Urza and his drake regained their third and fourth dimensions, wings unfolded into rushing air. Ahead, the Tellarian Academy huddled on the hillside. Ropey black pillars of smoke rose from it. Jaradargaz gave one magnificent sweep of her wings. Pitching treetops rolled away. The drake broke out over the battleground. Below, monstrous creatures ran in their loping hundreds towards a thinly defended wall. Drawing a deep breath, she hurled fire down on the Phyrexians. They burned away to greasy black smudges on the littered earth. A cheer rose up from behind the academy wall. The great dragon soared and banked out over the Phyrexian gorge. Ballistae bolts leapt up from the rent and cracked past her wings. With a single surge, she climbed beyond their reach.
"Yes!"
Urza shouted to the creature through the wheeling winds.
"Fight beside us, and you will have your son."
Then he was gone. He stepped from the back of the wheeling beast. The next moment, he appeared elsewhere, in a peaceful corner of Tellaria. His feet came to rest on a dam of rubble and mortar. The mighty barrier diverted water from the Phyrexian gorge. To one side of the broad pile of stone lurked the dark dome of Crick's vast time loop. To the other side lay a vast, blue reservoir. Water saved from the dank depths of the gorge. The lake was placid and mirror still, far from the mad battle. Fishes darted through its depths. Trees around its edges cast their souls in its surface.
"Forgive me,"
Urza said simply. Force blasted from his lowered fingertips. It pulverized the dam and hurled Urza into the air. Rocks separated. Water burst forward. The flood turned suddenly white, bearing in its brunt, scouring teeth of rock and lime. It roared over the precipice and punched into the gorge. The belly of the lake slumped downward and followed. Urza plummeted into the blue wall of water. It bore him along. It would disguise him. It would protect him. He would not be torn by the cross-currents of time. He would not be impaled by ballistae after ballistae. He would not even be seen in the jetting flood. And once within the time rent, he would destroy the spawning grounds where these Phyrexian monstrosities were made, would hunt down Crick and kill him, and would cleanse Tellaria forever of the Phyrexian menace. Joyra brought her Thran metal sword crashing down under the head of a gigantic fiend. She split the creature's sagittal crest and sent it sprawling back against the broken wall of the infirmary. The beast's divided head came to rest against the sill of a second-story window. Within that window, more monsters preyed on the bed-bound patients. Giving a roar, Joyra climbed the sloping corpse of her foe as though it were a staircase. Her sword crashed against the glazing and sent a spray of glass within. Roars and screams burst outward. Another swipe of her blade bashed flat the toothy shards of glass at the base of the window. She clambered over the sill. Many of the patients were already dead. The rest had put up the best resistance they could with crutches and canes for weapons. One of the more alchemically minded students had made impressive use of the various anesthetic compounds in the chamber. He had also concocted blast powder in small vials and kept 3 Phyrexians at bay by casting exploding filters at the feet of the attackers. Coming up behind them, Joyra swung her sword at the thick reptilian neck of one of the monsters. The Thran metal blade sliced through flesh and bone like a knife through water. The head lolled free and toppled toward Joyra, its eyes rolling and rows of triangular teeth snapping. By instinct alone, she caught the snarling thing by one pointed ear and thrust it away from her. One of the beast's comrades, a giant with a waddle of a bristly flesh, spun about to engage her. Its jaws roared open for a bite that could cut her in half. Again, in reflex, Joyra rammed the snapping head in the path of the teeth. The head clamped its dead bite on the living beast's tongue. Joyra hardly had withdrawn her hand before the larger Phyrexian chomped down on the severed head. Bone and tooth crunched and burst outward in a tangle of flesh that lodged itself chokingly in the giant's wattle. It gasped and staggered aside, retching. Joyra ended its agony with a jab up one nostril and into the creature's frontal lobe. It fell with a sick roar, wrenching Joyra's blade from her hand and pinning it under its body. A sharp pain exploded in her side. Joyra flew limply across the room to crash into the wall. Something stalked toward her, a huge something with gray-scaled skin, small insectile eyes, and ears that flared into venomous spikes. It cast aside cots with the same ease it had cast her aside. Joyra struggled backward but got caught in a tangle of canvas and broken wood. The beast lunged, its claws spread wide. Abruptly, against its gray bulk, there was a small figure in white. In one uplifted hand, the figure held a metal case filled with vials of the yellow-gray powder. Next moment, vials and case both were gone, rammed among the teeth. The monster's head blasted away, pelting the room with its pieces. The vacated corpse slumped heavily atop Joyra. "Are you all right?" Joyra shouted into the sudden calm. Her rescuer had spoken the exact same words. He rolled the dead bulk of the beast off of her, ducking away, and pried her sword from the other body. "I'm all right," they assured each other, again in unison. Joyra gladly received the blade. She thanked the slight young man who handed it to her. "Do you think you can make a stand here? Do you think you can hold the door and keep more of these things out?" "Yes," the young man said bravely. "Yes, if nobody climbs in the way you came." Joyra struggled up and staggered to the window. The yard between the infirmary and the academy wall was nearly deserted now, occupied only by hundreds of dead Phyrexians, humans, Viashino, and goblins. Even Ramadargaz had left the courtyard, taking wing with his mother. Together, beyond the wall, they roared down from the skies, sending lines of fire and sulfur into the hosts there. "There should be no more attacks from that quarter, unless they breach the wall again," Joyra guessed. She strode toward the infirmary door. "The battle has moved inside. It'll be room to room now. Can you hold this one?" "Yes," the man repeated. "Good," Joyra said and strode out into the hallway. A great ruckus poured from the hall of artifact creatures ahead. Sighing wearily, Joyra ran toward the sound. A room-to-room battle with her friends in the rooms. Karn in the observatory, Teferi in the great hall, Diago in the master's study, Turd in the cellars, Baron in the rectory, and Joyra herself in the hall of artifact creatures. A small smile played about her lips. What Phyrexian host could be a match for a group like that? She would have to remind Urza as he constructed his flying warship to make sure to man it with the best of crews. Her face darkened. She would remind Urza if they both lived through the day. Urza rose from the vile sludge at the base of the canyon with an exertion of will. He sloughed the muck of dead fish and tenacious seaweed from his robes. The shallow lake churned with the flood that poured into the gorge behind him. Up in the Phyrexian city, though, all was still. Baron had been right. Crick had thrown every able creature into the assault, wanting at long last to eradicate the school. The only Phyrexians who remained were ballistae crews, sentinels, and those incapable of passing the temporal barrier. Chief of those was, of course, Crick. There would also be another crop of vat-grown monsters. Urza would not leave until they were all dead. From decades of observation, Urza knew where the mutagenic labs lay deep within the basaltic extrusion on which the city was built. With a thought, he was in a dark, deep cavern. An aisle of vats extended ahead of him and behind him. Stonework stanchions stood between panels of smoky obsidian. Behind these panels were bays of glistening oil, Phyrexian blood, and placental fluid. Crick had likely filled these cells by draining thousands of his citizens. The emptied husks would then have been diced and jerked to make food for the creatures developing in the tanks. Phyrexians had switched from natural to artificial means of reproduction when placentas began in utero to consume their mothers from the inside out. The grotesque figures within these tanks seemed utterly capable of matricide. Though immature, most were the size of a full-grown human, with nictating membranes over large, roomy eyes, knobby shoulders, soft claws, oil-breathing lungs, and rows of legs, some thickening into actual limbs and others withering and dropping away, leaving only hip nubs. In a number of the dark vats, vestigial leg bones hung from the half-formed teeth of the blind beasts, a snack between scheduled feedings. Urza was sickened. He rose toward the cavern ceiling out of the aisle of vats. It dropped away beneath him, revealing row upon row of vats beyond. 100, 500, 2,500, a network of boned catwalks ran above each row. Across the ivory causeway, machines scuttled, dipping probes into the glistening oil, dumping chips of dried meat onto the heads of hungry creatures and skimming waste from the top. Urza recognized pieces from his Falcon engines in the design of these nursemaid machines. No wonder Crick had sent the whole city on this attack. In months of his own time, mere weeks outside, Crick would have a whole new city, a whole new army. Not any longer. As Urza drifted up into the dark vault of the cavern, he lowered his hands, spread his fingers, and sent great blue flashes of lightning down into the vats. Where the bolts struck glistening oil, massive plumes of fire rose. The figures within oil writhed. Blue-white sparks traced out their curved fangs in the venom sacs beneath their throats. Arcs leapt finger to finger, knee to toe. The creatures convulsed, churning the oil, feeding the fires. In moments, flames wreathed their exposed heads and then mantled their shoulders and then girded their hips. Thick skin burned, cracked, and split and curled back, looking like bark. Muscle cooked. Bones burst. One by one, the waiting army of Crick stewed where it stood. At the last, as all the glistening oil flared into the air, the sudden intense heat change shattered the obsidian shells. Shards of glass and bits of burnt Phyrexians scattered down the aisles. More lightning flared, more vats erupted. Half of them were gone. Urza panted. Feeling the drain of power on him, he would recover quickly, of course, and needed only one spell to slay Crick. Until these all were destroyed, Talaria would not be safe. Blue energy leapt from his fingers. Orange columns of fire blazed in the cavern night. Black clouds of soot and smoke belched up to roll at the height of the chamber. Dizzy with exertion, Urza blasted the last of the vats and watched as their inhabitants burned in putrid eyes. This ought to flush out Crick. Urza stopped breathing. The air in the space could be nothing but sheer poison. He lifted his eyes wearily toward the vault. There, black smoke rolled in the deeper blackness of the cave. Something else moved there, too. Something silvery and fleet and... The shriek of the stooping Falcon engine sliced through smoke and fire and oil. Urza raised his gaze just in time to see the creature's fierce eyes glinting above its knife-edged beak. Impact. Urza fell, struck from the sky like a sparrow. He crashed among oil-dripping glass shards. They were the least of his worries. His belly was filled with a mass of rending steel, macerated liver, and bone chips. The cometary creature had sliced into him and flung itself open. The whining whir of its shredding mechanism was unmistakable. The thing tore through muscle and viscera, snapped ribs, and rattled against backbone. With a supreme effort of will, Urza stanched the flow of blood, reassembled tissues and organs, reconstructed himself out of the remembrance of being whole, but the machine was too quick. It destroyed any tissue that reformed. Urza was being slain by his own invention, reprogrammed to no longer seek glistening oil, but the smell of Urza's own blood. It was his turn to writhe. He jittered across the shards of glass. Every moment his mind threatened to blank out. There was not enough left of his physical form to sustain belief, to power the thought that would allow him to planeswalk and escape this horror. Perhaps if he had not spent so much power in destroying the Phyrexian army, he could have mustered the strength. Now, though, he was pinned like a fly to a card. His gemstone eyes speckled with his own tossed blood. He struggled to reassemble himself, to draw each of those spots of blood back into the streams and vessels whence they came. The task was nearly impossible. He could not escape the machine, nor could he let himself merely die. He could only feel forever the ravening teeth of the device. At least he had destroyed the army, if he hadn't destroyed Crick. As though summoned by the thought, the man appeared. The term man could little apply to him now, though. Crick was little more than an animate skeleton. His time-vulnerable flesh had been mortified from his body over the centuries of his imprisonment. It had been replaced in patient succession by grafts of flesh from each new generation of negators. He had been slowly rebuilding himself, hoping someday to escape the gorge where he was imprisoned. His body now had a sinewy look to it, as though he were not a single man, but a series of eels sewn together in the shape of a man. At the extremities of his figure, fingers, toes, knees, elbows, and brow, spikes had sprouted, most of them hollow-tipped and venom-dripping. Only the man's face remained roughly human in shape, and his eyes. They were bright and blue and human.
After your last visit, Urza, I know your weakness. Keeping you to death, then you cannot escape. Battlestate bolts and sword strokes are too clumsy, though. They leave moments of lucidity, and one moment is all it takes.
Crick purred as he approached. His clawed and iron-heeled tread cracked chunks of glass as he walked.
This solution is much safer. A nice piece of poetry. Thank you for the Falcon engines. I have 40 more, stationed around the gorge, should you succeed in planeswalking.
Urza, unable even to draw a breath to respond, could only stare in stunned agony at his nemesis. As he focused his thoughts inward on perpetual healing, one curl of his mind marveled that this monster spoke so well the tongues of men.
That was your great mistake, Urza. Coming here the first time, it taught us everything we needed to know. That has always been your great mistake, Urza. Stumbling into our realm, letting us look you over, and then retreating while we prepared what we needed to kill you. You did it first in Koilos, and we followed you out. You did it again in Phyrexia, and we followed you out. You led us to Sarah's realm, you know. We attacked and invaded. They think they eventually defeated us, but we're still there. We've never left. We never leave a place. Once you lead us to it. We've been engineering the transformation of Sarah's realm. The angels think they still rule it, but it is ours. It is one of our staging grounds for the full-scale invasion of your world. We've never left this place either. And now, today, we have taken this island from you.
Urza wished he could spit his defiance. He wished he could remind Crick that his mutant army was dead, both inside the gorge and outside. He was left with only a handful of guards, and no matter how many modifications he underwent, Crick would never be able to squeeze his brain out of the time cage where he was trapped. Urza wanted to say all this, but he could do nothing more than hold on to consciousness as he shivered across the rubble-strewn floor. He didn't need to say any of it. Crick seemed to know.
By the way, you haven't destroyed all the vats. This is only the smallest chamber. I have 3 others. I have 8,000 warriors there. I have 2,000 that are ready to emerge.
That was it then. Crick would taunt Urza a while more, then draw his sword and lop off his head. Even if Urza could somehow muster the strength to planeswalk, which at that moment he could not escape the time pit, could not even step beyond this death chamber. 3 other falcons circled within the rolling black smoke overhead. That was it. Urza would die, Crick would live, 2,000 more Phyrexians would emerge to sweep away the final resistance. 6,000 more would emerge to make Talaria a Phyrexian stronghold on Dominaria. The invasion Urza was only beginning to prepare for would be fully underway. That was it. All was lost.
I see by the look in your remarkable eyes that you have at last grasped your defeat, Urza Planeswalker. The seed of it was contained in those first moments at Koilos. From the beginning, you had lost everything.
Crick advanced, drawing a scimitar with slow relish.
I had been hoping to watch you torment a bit longer. But it was only fun before you broke.
Urza shuddered with the unholy motion of the thing shredding his innards. He almost let go in that moment, if only to steal Crick's final victory. But an impulse arose in him to remain a moment more. Crick towered over him now and lifted his scimitar high.
Good night, Planeswalker.
The blade descended. In the moment before it struck, a sudden surge of power filled Urza, strength from within him, but strength that was not his. Multani. It was strength enough for a single planeswalk. With the power came a whispered word, the one place to which Urza could planeswalk that would mask him from the Falcons and give him final victory.
Crick.
With a thought, Urza stepped out of space. He disappeared from the floor and the rattling creature. For a breath, he was in a nowhere place, but he did not linger there, lest the Phyrexian would understand. With a second thought, Urza stepped back into reality. He emerged at the exact core of Crick's body. Urza's form of scintillating energy swelled into being from the spot, bursting the Phyrexian's flesh in a rain of meat and glistening oil. Crick exploded, and in his place stood an oil-drenched planeswalker. Bits of eel skin spattered out across the ruined vats. Urza held still, not daring to blink or breathe. The falcon that had moments before been rending him rattled to a stop on the glass-strewn floor. It withdrew its gearwork wings and treaders, folded them against its sides, and turned its head quizzically. The machine seemed to sniff the air, It trotted forward a few paces and pecked experimentally at the glass shards. Then, in a rush of metal wings, the thing leapt into the air and climbed into the smoke clouds above to join its counterparts.
Move quietly.
Came the voice of Multani within Urza.
We have 3 more chambers to cleanse.
Urza complied. He rose quietly into the air, sought out a doorway leading from the cavern, and slid through the air toward it. As he drifted smoothly along, Urza sent a thought inward, toward the forest spirit that inhabited him. "Then we are allies?" Multani's response came without pause.
You have known the agony of Argoth. We have known the agony of Phyrexia. If these are the creatures you fight, we are allies.
A sigh escaped Urza. He watched nervously to see if any of the falcons would pick up the scent of his breath. When none did, Urza sent,
"I am glad of it. I'll need your strength to finish cleansing the gorge."
Multani replied,
When we are out of this pit and back into the forested isle, I can conclude this battle for you.
Joyra had linked up with her old comrades as they purged the academy of Phyrexians. They had pursued the beasts out of every chamber and corridor in the place, at last cornering a knot of 12 monsters in the far courtyard. Here, though, the tide had turned. The defenders of Talaria found themselves fighting for their lives. The situation was the same elsewhere. The Phyrexians had been forced from the battlefields by the drakes, runners, scorpions, and human fighters, but once in the woods, they held their ground, destroying whatever pumas dropped from the trees onto them. They would have slain thousands of Phyrexians, but whatever hundreds survived would only return to the fast time rent to rise again. The defenders despaired. The forests themselves rose. Tree branches swiped down to lash Phyrexian faces and tangle them in bows and strangle them. Vines fastened around limbs and ripped them from their sockets. Mosquitoes and gnats and flies swarmed the monsters and flayed them alive. Leaves, hardened by some strange will, cut like daggers across fleeing legs. Within the courtyard, the very grass beneath the feet of the 12 Phyrexians shot up in sudden life, piercing feet and slicing through legs and dragging the monsters down to their graves. The shout that went up in that moment was weary and scattered, but it was the shout of victory. It is finished. The invasion of Talaria is finished. I have never in my life felt so weary, incapable of even the simplest spell, capable of even releasing this dagger I clutched so tightly. But I did not save the island. Urza and his 6-part alliance saved it. And if he can rally the folk of Dominaria like this, perhaps he can save the world after all. Baron, Mage Master of Talaria,